Abram takes care of things. Abram Goldowski started his car and drove off towards Adam. People walking on the street turned their heads to see the unprecedented phenomenon of a Triumph Stag parking in front of the scrap heap, and a man in a spanking new suit stepping out of it. His head was shaved and shining like a Christmas bauble, smelling wonderfully in the spring breeze, as if the lilacs had bloomed prematurely. Abram lurchingly felt his way down the dark corridor until he got to Adam's door, and pounded on it with his fist. "Get up!" he shouted. "Car's out front!" There was some shuffling inside, and a few moments later a hazy light came out from the open door. Adam stood in the doorway, wearing a blanket and blinking the sleep from his eyes. "Again you're asleep," Abram said as he elbowed despairingly inside. He pushed the heap of clothes off the room's only chair and sat down. It was clear it would take more than just a minute to get out of here. "Wait, I'll make coffee," Adam said. "Get dressed. We'll get coffee on the way. I'm not about to spend half the day gawking around while you put your shoes on. Chop!" Mikiewicz wandered around the room with a sock in his hand, overturning piles of clothes as he looked for another one more or less the same. He lifted his finds one by one to his nose to smell them. Finally, one sock seemed acceptable. "My eyes are so sleepy," he complained. "I'm going to go splash some water on my face in the kitchen." He drank a big mug of cold water, wet a finger under the sink, and rubbed an eye with it, and then the other eye. Eventually he had sniffed out a decent enough set of people clothes and put them on. Abram was truly a patient man. "Good, let's go. I'm taking you to eat first," Goldowski said, peppily. He hadn't slept at all that night, and there was a hint of weariness somewhere under the cleanliness and freshness. On the way they got a bag full of doughnuts and 2 hot coffees. They had to get Koticek. They had something to tell him. Adam's father had 2 brothers, and thus Adam had 2 uncles. One uncle, Tomasz, was so well off, was so full of himself, was of such shining countenance, that even from a distance you saw that he was a nice, pure man, an intellectual. His temples twinkled silver, and he wore rustic clothes like Tolstoy, light and linen, while his hair was almost to his shoulders and combed back over his head. He had a batch of children with a batch of women, because he upgraded his wife every 5 or 10 years. The most recent was indeed not the most attractive, but was nevertheless very young. He'd already had 2 children with her, and a third was on the way. This uncle was a well-known musician, less famous than Karel Gott, but a success all the same. There was a solemn power in his songs. Strength. He was a busy man, and Adam had only seen him 3 or 4 times in his entire life, mainly at weddings. There is no reason to dwell any longer on him here. His other uncle was like a decayed radioactive element. He'd somehow fallen behind everything and been thrown out of everywhere. He paid for his vodka by happenstance translation work, in addition to the eternal crutch of intellectuals who've fallen to the bottom of the barrel, making crossword puzzles. Radek Mikiewicz lived in a room in the attic of a big grey house. Such little caves were designed from the beginning to house the poorest sorts. Impoverished students, widowed old men, and other forms of detritus had made their nest there. There was no front room and no kitchen. It was simply a long hallway of identical doors leading to identical holes, each with a small window. At the end of the hallway was little more than a toilet, common to all and in shocking condition. At the other end of the hallway was an old cast-iron sink, where people lined up to brush their teeth in the evenings. There was always a loud slopping noise when someone went to fill their buckets or pots there. But there was nothing to be ashamed of in Radek's nest. He was an early riser, especially when he'd taken a day's break from drinking, and he sat in a wobbly chair by the window and watched the pigeons. He had a beautiful view over the rooftops, and here and there between the houses trees had started to green lightly. But he could also look out in such a way as to see no signs of human activity. For that, all he had to do was lie down, and there it was. Only sky as far as the eye could see. Thin, delicate little white clouds rode across the empty blue. The sun shone, and the birds flew. The walls of his cubbyhole were covered in bookshelves that were abnormally well organised. The spines of the books were flush with each other to within a millimetre's depth. 2 mattresses covered the entire extent of the floor. Living on the floor is an ancient and honest custom. No one knows who had the stupid idea of putting legs on beds. Now they can just get up and walk away. The second of the two mattresses belonged to a drinking buddy of Radek's called Kotacek, who always had money because it was his golden hands that made state decorations. He enamelled the insignia and coats of arms. But he was a bachelor, and he'd somehow wound up at Radek's while Radek was between women. Because Radek wasn't a bachelor, not at all. He was an extraordinary womanizer, and even in the worst of circumstances could always manage to find himself a squeeze. They were always slightly above marriageable age, and never rejected such a nice man as Radek, who brought along vodka and company. These were the men Abram and Adam were on the way to see. Plans were spouting in Abram's head, plans that needed financing. Thankfully, both geezers were home. The air in the room was dank and boozy from yesterday, and Radek did his guest the honour of cracking the window. A beautiful speckled pigeon walked back and forth along the window-sill. "Hey, Radek, hello," Adam said, hesitating. "Kotacek, meet Abram Goldovsky." Pan Goldovsky confidently extended his hand, which was clean and decorated with an expensive watch and big golden rings. "Listen, fellas, I have something to tell you that might turn out profitable for all of us. Kotacek, I hear you work in a very unique capacity. Golden hands. There's only one such man in all of Poland. Just think, all of our country's sublime honours pass through your hands." Kotacek scratched his grey mane. He was a very quiet, modest man. He offered, doubtfully. "Isn't it, though? Don't people come to you with all kinds of old medals? You know, to have them polished or the enamel repaired or things like that. Sometimes somebody maybe even offers to sell them?" Abram probed him. Do see that kind of thing," the old man murmured. "You know, occasional widow with her husband's crosses. Well, in a pinch, you know, or somebody comes with a bag full of that kind of thing. All of them their own, yeah. Been known to happen." "I knew it. Good man. Listen, I collect all kinds of militaria. I'm absolutely crazy for orders. If that kind of thing comes in, someone wants to sell it, let me know, okay? And if they don't want to sell it, find out their contact information and I'll try and strike a deal with them." "Can certainly try. You don't get a smack in the mouth for trying." Pan Goldovsky grinned widely. The conversation continued until it was time to butter the old man up a little bit. "I'm going to run out to the car for a sec," Goldovsky said. "Be right back." He went and got a big bag that clattered suspiciously, hauled it up to the attic and put it on the windowsill. Abram almost even liked to make people happy, to help them in any way he could. He stuck his hand into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. No, what are you—" Kotacek started to wave Goldovsky away. "No, don't need it. I've money up to the ears and nothing to do but blow it on drink anyhow. We drink at home, rarely out. What'll I do with your money? Actually, I should like to ask the young man here." He turned now towards Adam. "You think Pani Makievich would embroider me something nice? Traditional, maybe? I've got this farmstead out near Krakow, my own, you see. Like some women's work for it." "I believe she would. Not like all that shtickerai fits in our house any more," Adam reflected. "I'll certainly ask." Poor old Kotacek sitting there alone on a wooden bedstead in a dilapidated farmhouse, and behind him is a white tapestry decorated with corn poppies. He should definitely have something like that, especially if Goldovsky starts buying sacks of virtuti militari off him. Goldovsky was always having fun plying this little trade in his spare time. Militaria was raked in and then smuggled over the border, where it could be sold for extraordinary sums. The passion for collecting is ancient and sacred, one of those few things that give meaning to human existence. And all the middlemen say, as if in unison, that they don't collect anything, which is strictly speaking true, although Abram held on to a little stock of the best things, and he liked those very much. Orders are the summit of the collector's passion. Coins too, of course, but orders are a class unto themselves. Their value never decreases. It is surer to own a small but admirable stock of honour medals than it is to own gold, forest land, a house in the city, or a painting by a Polish artist of some older generation. Naturally, you were not officially allowed to sell them, but this made things even sweeter. Several orders of Lenin had passed through Goldovsky's hands, as had one or two Lenin prizes, which was an especially rare combination. You didn't exactly need magic to get yourself an order. They handed them out left and right in the hundreds of thousands. But the prize! How long had he had to besiege an old widow before she let him get his hands on her husband's Lenin prize? 6 months? And how little he ended up paying her for it. Well, and justifiably. The old bag wasn't selling the prize with the documentation, which would have been a shame she couldn't stomach. Moron. Well, that's how it went. Anonymously. Goldovsky had sources and connections in Moscow, so he was constantly going there and back, by train, to save on airfare. He'd have to see what he could get out of Kotacek. It could be a complete dead end. But in short, the plans were as follows. They were bounced out of Zittau in 3 months. In their place was installed a reputable 67-year-old man of letters, who would otherwise have earned his pension with distinction. For some reason, such an important thing as Polish culture could only be entrusted to the hands of people of a very worthy age. That way, culture stays nicely as it has always been, moves nowhere, and there is peace in the house. A headache over culture is the last thing the government of any country wants. Ptui! Culture! The last thing anybody needs is for culture types to start rioting. But that was just what happened on account of Zittau's failed cabal. Therefore, oversight of the newspaper was handed over in quick time to a doddery fart. Who, where, and how much heat was taken over this Goldovsky nonsense will remain forever hidden in the nooks of the corridors of power. There had been some hope for the boys, but this had been a colossal miscalculation, and heads certainly rolled. Still, Abram hadn't despaired for a moment. His fame shined like a bright star. If it had indeed once been tarnished, it was now certain that anything he got into would bring him only success. "Boys," he said to them, "we have everything. Nothing will change. All the projects will come to fruition. It's only now that we can actually see what kind of power we are. We don't even need that mouldy shit-stained Zittau. Use it to wipe your asses. Let's make the kind of poisia that's never been seen before. We'll overpay all the writers." Until then, the newspaper had gone out with a budget of essentially zero. Goldovsky promised them mountains of gold. He might even sell off some of his finest medals to come up with a bit of the money. Or so he said one day. The next day he had the idea of doing some films. Films get serious money behind them. It's a sure thing, a lock. Polish films are always good, even if they're bad, and you can do pretty much anything on screen, even show naked women. Or then make a newspaper like the New York Times, something people take super seriously. And basically, it would be best to move all this gifted potential out of Poland little by little, because you can't do anything here. Everything here is makeshift and unfinished. But we should still dig up some normal officers for the editorial board. I'm aiming for an empty old factory. In the long run, you could bring all kinds of cool things in there. Be a very good space for young people's work. And we could officially make poisia a young people's paper. Like on a state subsidy or something. Long run. Right now it'll still have to look out for itself. Solicit contribution pieces. Get contribution pieces. Say we'll pay. We'll pay a normal rate. But then, when we get officers, then Adam will get his own room, and there can be a mattress on the floor, and a gigantic ashtray and a coffee mug chained to the wall. Solisław was more than lukewarm towards all suggestions. Despite it all, Adam did rouse himself from his inertia, because the thought that it would all soon suddenly end still hadn't crossed anybody's mind. During those climactic days they had actually gained friends, in addition to enemies, and Adam now began to feel these friends out. Goldovsky demanded quantity. "So that it's always there, a lot of it, and about everything," he insisted. Strangely enough, the articles they ordered for money were far worse than the ones the plucky Brotherhood had produced out of vanity. The paid-for drivel that landed on their desks reminded them precisely of the professional culture that they loathed, only this was even worse than that, because it was homespun and amateur. Everybody liked the money, of course, so people started diligently submitting God knows what kinds of whiny filth. Everybody grabbed a pencil and wrote what came to their minds, and nothing that came to their minds was interesting or sincere, but was instead empty blather about some happening in Polish cultural life, and it was all pathetic. Adam had been right. The only thing you can do with money is to give it away, and it's better to do so without the hope of getting anything nice in return. Maybe it would have gotten better over time. Maybe they would have found new, interesting staff writers. Maybe they could have hauled some edgy thinkers out of their dens, but they got nothing out of the udarniks currently writing for them. Their activity was a pitiable parody of former days. It was a painful blow to Sulisvaf's honour. His decision was made just when Arda left the house for the hospital. Dissolve it. No, he didn't manage it with a bang, but with a kind of nasty whimper. But a horrible end is still better than an incoherent slog in the name of incoherent goals. They weren't Sulisvaf's goals, after all. Did he want to publish screeds about Polish shit for the rest of his life? No, certainly not any more. You can't do anything if you don't have a vision, and he didn't have that. They'd completely lost their heads. All this cash Goldovsky was planning to get from somewhere was absurd. He was trying to pump it into a dead elephant. So Poisja used unsuspecting Arda's garden to get completely wasted and organise barbarities. The consensus opinion was, but it can't just end like this. It can, Sulisvaf answered. It can only be this way. Never was, not now, not again. In 3 years nobody will know anything about any Poisja. What's that, they'll ask. Never heard of it. And the projects, someone asked. My book? Rusnak's exhibition? None of those? That was a promise. Nothing? I just started to feel I was important. I so want to be important. Yes, shithead. Nothing more. I don't know what'll happen with your book, and I honestly don't care. The thing that got on my nerves most of all was the dude who wrote a new article about a movie he'd seen every week. It was 10 pages long, and he was constantly asking for his money. He asked every hour, explained one anguished comrade sadly to another. Eventually drove me out of my mind. I'd have beaten him to death with my bare hands. Never again. Never again will I get involved with this kind of money-grubbing self-starter sewage. And the most obnoxious thing is that eventually he got paid. Should have whooped his ass behind a dumpster instead. Adam started drinking again that night. This ended exactly as it had before, with brawling, and then he spent the next 3 days lying in bed, oblivious to the world. To throw salt on the wound, this was one of the rare times that Eva looked up where Adam was living. She did actually know, but she went there as rarely as possible, because the picture that showed itself to her there was hard for her heart to bear. There seemed to be no hope that this man would ever put himself together or become decent and respectable. Instead it seemed that he was already ending his days besieged by a looming disaster. It never occurred to Eva that this kind of carelessness about one's surroundings, the ability to not even notice them, is very rare and maybe even a blessing. Absolutely every time she entered Adam's living space, she started to put things in order. She disliked doing this very much, and her son liked it even less. But Eva couldn't do otherwise. Her hands simply set to work of their own volition, and when she'd toiled tirelessly for maybe 4 or 5 hours, all the dishes were washed, all the rags picked up from the floor, and all the cigarette butts thrown out, and so on. Adam was never once grateful. And for some reason, some force now drove her out of the house to go see her son. The doors were open, but that was typical. Adam didn't live at Arkadius's old studio anymore, but in some dead old lady's apartment, full of vases, polka-dot mugs, silk handkerchiefs, and busted old furniture, which is to say that the apartment was an absolute triumph. Put Adam in a place already full of stuff, and it's easy enough to imagine how things will go. At first, Eva thought that the boy wasn't home, and she wanted to start on the dishes in the kitchen out of habit, but then she heard a grumbling, as if the disaster had already begun. Adam was sleeping off his hangover in the back room, head first under the blanket, and soaked in sweat. He'd already slept for 14 hours, and didn't plan to get up any time soon. Eva tried to probe him gently about what had happened, but Adam merely pressed his lips together and rolled his eyes to the back of his head so that only the whites showed. Eva knew to let him be, from long experience with Jakub. There's nothing to do with a person in such a state but wait until he becomes a person again, if he does. She set a big mug of water next to the bed and started to clean, mechanically. Running her hands under the cold water, memories of a long-forgotten event came to her mind. When she was travelling to her father's funeral, although, what funeral really, it would be better to say that she was on the way to the morgue, a woman sat next to her on the train. Eva had immediately noticed her at the little station when she arrived. She was slim, not very young, but also not old, with light but still dull brown hair of medium length, and she was wearing a white flowery dress with an old-fashioned effect, something that might have been more suitable for a young girl and seemed somehow unseemly on her. She was wearing socks and sandals and 2 bracelets of wooden beads on one hand. At first the woman stood by the door, and Ava watched her carefully but distractedly. Later, the person sitting next to Ava got off, and the woman sat down. Ava didn't remember what she'd been thinking in that moment. She certainly wasn't thinking about her father, about death, or about the funeral. It was a very warm and beautiful summer day. Suddenly, she noticed that the woman next to her was sitting up straight as a board, with her 2 long scrawny legs pressed hard together, and she was weeping big tears that simply flowed down her face, which was motionless. Ava felt strange and uncomfortable, but she didn't say or do anything. They passed 2 stops like this before the woman stood up and addressed Ava. "Forgive me. It's very hard for me to sit next to you. You seem to be grieving." She remembers that she wasn't in the least bit surprised. If she thought anything at all, it was only that a person who feels the emotions of others so deeply must have a hard life. And that was all. She didn't think of magic, or of mystical happenings, of clairvoyance, extrasensory perception, or indeed of God, whom she hadn't thought about in ages. As soon as she got off the train, Ava forgot this woman completely as she plodded through the oppressive heat towards the hospital. And this came to her now for no reason whatsoever. And she still took no position on God, on miracles, or on the strange ways of fate. She simply remembered and washed the dishes.